There were skull fractures in Mr. O'Keefe's skull, both in the back and the front aspect of his skull. I noted that there was recent subdural hemorrhage. That is blood that is under the dura, and the dura is a very tough protective cover that sits over the brain. I noted that there was subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's hemorrhage that is directly on top of the brain under the leptomeninges, which is a very thin membrane that covers the brain.
Now, with reference to the head, as far as the skull, you indicated that there were fractures as in plural, correct?
Yes.
And with reference to the fractures, what, if any, relationship did you know between the fractures that you observed and the laceration to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head that you spoke about in your external examination?
So the laceration on the scalp that I observed was overlying the area of the skull that appeared to be fractured, or at least appeared that the fractures were originating from that point of impact and extending into the rest of the skull. This would be on the back of the skull, slightly right of midline.
Is that sort of?
It's the right occipital.
Now, in reference to that laceration in the area of the originating fracture in the back of the skull, what, if anything, did you determine in regard to impact in regard to that area of the head?
Well, the laceration along with, so the tear in the skin along with the scrape, because they were adjacent, are both evidence of blunt impact. So I knew at that point that Mr. O'Keefe's head had come in contact with a blunt object.
Would that be sort of the point of impact between the blunt object and Mr. O'Keefe's head?
Right.
Now, with reference to the fractures that you observed, how extensive were the fractures that you observed, the multiple ones?
Well, there were multiple fractures. So by definition, multiple fractures, multiple chambers or parts of the skull. So I would say they were extensive.
This is when you were with Mr. O'Keefe on track.
So he was still out in the weather at that point, so bleeding wasn't really obvious at that point. As soon as we get him into the back of the ambulance, then we start noticing hemorrhage from different areas of his body.
And when you say hemorrhage from different areas, which areas specifically?
So mostly from his mouth, his eyes, nose.
And just to be clear for the record, when you use the term hemorrhage based on your training experience, what do you understand that?
Bleeding, external bleeding.
Now, you mentioned that there was some suctioning of Mr. O'Keefe's airway, is that correct?
Correct.
And what, if anything, specifically was suctioned from Mr. O'Keefe's?
Suctioning from the airway was mostly blood, blood, sputum.
And as far as how much, what if anything, you have to sort of measure how much blood was suctioned out of Mr. O'Keefe's airway?
So we have a canister that has marks of milliliters, so we can determine as we're suctioning how much is in that container at different times.
And about how much, based on that, was suctioned from Mr. O'Keefe's airway?
So the initial suctioning with the rigid tip was about 150 milliliters. And subsequently, so that would have been above the airway in the mouth in that type of area. We established the intubation, and then deep suctioning with that soft tip through the intubation tube would have been another 50 milliliters of fluid. What's that? Sorry.
You mentioned some observations you made earlier in reference to Mr. O'Keefe's back.
Yes.
And what were those again?
So that would have been redness of the skin and the posterior of the body.
What, if any, significance did that have to you as far as your observation goes?
So redness from the skin, if it's general across the body, can mean certain things. If it's just a particular area, and due to the fact that it was cold outside, that would have been the initial stages of frostbite or exposure to cold.
And as far as the remainder of Mr. O'Keefe's body, what, if any, other observations did you make, in which areas did you make those observations to in regard to the initial state?
So for as far as the cold exposure, cold exposure, we're looking at the most exterior parts. Extreme cold exposure can lead to frost nip and frostbite in different areas. The first affected areas are going to be your fingers, your ears, your nose, your toes, that type of. So that was a cold, waxy, pale, stark white substance, basically, or condition of his skin.
And on each of those areas that you just described?
Yes.
Now, sort of up in the area of Mr. O'Keefe's head, you mentioned some bleeding from the eyes and the nose, correct?
Yes.
As well as his mouth.
Yes.
And beyond that, what, if any, observations did you make of any other sort of injuries to his head or his face?
So his eyes were pretty well swollen. We were trying to clear areas of blood to figure out if there were any contusions around the head. I believe there was a contusion on his forehead. Also had some markings on his extremities as well.
And just as far as your understanding, based on your training experience, when you use the word contusion, what do you understand that?
Bruising.
And before we get to the extremities, what, if any, observations did you make as far as Mr. O'Keefe's abdomen?
Abdomen we noted as significant as distension or swelling of the belly.
And what, if any, significance did that have to you in regard to Mr. O'Keefe?
It's another of our detailed assessments. We go through the body in a more detailed way to try and find more clues that we can pass on for the assessment. Distension in the belly could be due to trauma or bloating. It could be, those are usually our biggest triggers for distension.
Now, you mentioned, as far as the extremities are concerned, what, if anything, did you observe as far as injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's?
So we're looking at, so we had the cold, rigid fingers, hands, feet, and we had multiple dry blood lacerations to the right arm.
Recall specifically where on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm?
Would have been his upper arm.
And you mentioned dry blood, is that correct?
Yes.
So these were not actively bleeding at the time that you observed them?
No.
Now, as far as being dry blood versus actively bleeding, what, if anything, does that indicate to you as far as sort of timing?
So we had active bleeding from other areas in the body. So the fact that it had already stopped and clotted, I would assume that would have been several hours before the incident that led him to be there, but I would guess earlier in the evening. So first round of epinephrine. After that, we would drop in what's called an OPA. That would be to push the tongue out of the way, open up the airway to improve our bag valve mass so it has an open way to get the oxygen into the lungs. We begin external warming, stripping the patient, getting the heat turned up in the back of the ambulance. We would then switch over from manual CPR done by hand to a mechanical CPR device to ensure adequate, consistent CPR compressions of the chest. It was a Lucas device. Put that on the patient. And then we continue with another round of epi. Patient's starting to warm up at this time, so we would do suction at that point to try and suction fluid out of the airway to improve ventilation efforts. Another round of epi is done. We have another suction, this time through a deep suction via the endotracheal tube. Sorry, at 6:22 after warming, we intubated the patient. We have a 7.5 tube paced at 27 centimeters, and then verified through various means, through chest rise, auscultation, waveform, and tidal CO2. So we had complications listed as patient vomiting, aspirating. Suction was then done with a rigid tip suction device. After successful intubation, we then suctioned via French tube through the airway established. Jump back up to 6:31. Another IO line was established on the opposite tibia on the left side. And then another 3 rounds of epi, and then arrival at the hospital.
When Mr. O'Keefe, you observed him on the ground, what, if any, snow did you observe on or around him in that area?
So the snow was probably up to the mid-axillary point, so we're looking at probably halfway up his rib point. Top of his body was clear.
And do you know about how much snow was covering his body up to the mid-axillary?
I'd say probably about 4 inches, 4 to 6 inches.